Back in the day, games had to be short. You couldn't take home an arcade cab, and even once we got consoles, a game needed to be beaten in one sitting. This led to the 3 lives design pattern and high score chasing, probably inherited from old pinball machines, which dominated up until the next big game changer. Da-na-na-na! Legend of Zelda shows up with an open world and a memory card. The game wasn't meant to be a challenge run, but an adventure with a map to memorize and secrets to unearth. 30 years later, you'd be hard-pressed to find a game that doesn't bookmark your progress for later, but very few of them actually treat the feature as a mechanic. It's an overwrite standard to subvert. Before we get started, let's break down examples of save states that actively hurt their games. The obvious example is as frustrating as it is out of date. Punishing the player for failure by setting them back a ways isn't interesting. The only reason it exists is because arcade cabs didn't have bookmarking features, so the way to win was to muscle through the entire game in one sitting. If you've already proven that you can overcome a challenge, then it isn't interesting to see if you can do it again. I can see some value in a perfect run, but holding a long period of the player's time hostage isn't very nice. I'd argue that too many checkpoints are always better than too few, but the other end of the spectrum isn't great either. If you're able to save before every important decision, then the only reason a player wouldn't go for a perfect run each time is because of self-imposed restrictions, which some people just don't have the discipline for. Take permadeath games like XCOM, where instead of a serious consequence for failure, most players seem to treat a dead character as a boring old game over and reload. It actively downplays the core appeal of the game when you're able to just jump back and forth whenever you want. With that out of the way, let's see how we can play with all the information recorded over the course of a playthrough. This video will contain significant mega spoilers for these games here. Twists that recontextualize the game level stuff. All are recommended before watching, but not mandatory. The next most basic move to pull after recording the player's game history is to have the game comment on how they're doing compared to previous runs. Playtimes and high scores pit players against themselves and others, trying to beat the game in the fastest, most efficient, and highest ranking ways. This eventually got cross-pollinated with RPG character building and produced morality systems, where players would have their actions judged ethically to see what kind of person they pretended to be. Now it's become commonplace for a game to adapt and respond to a player's actions, influencing the story and its endings. With that said, only very recently, and even then very rarely, have games figured out how to reuse data from old runs in interesting ways. The king is 2015's Undertale, which takes the morality system from earlier, but rather than uniquely stylizing each route for replayability, it turns the whole game into one big time travel thriller. The goal of the game is to pacify each enemy without using violence, but it's built in a way to ensure you take a life, if not by accident, then either by misunderstanding what you're supposed to be doing, or just curiosity. The idea is to make the player save scum, going back to an old file to fix their mistake, only to remind them of their screw-ups via NPCs who are able to manipulate and see through time. They even have a character with the ability to save and reload states, who at one point intentionally crashes the game to prove a point. That's the kind of fourth wall breaking, untapped potential I'm talking about. The next logical extreme after reading the save data from other runs of the same game is to read the data of entirely different games on the same system. The obvious example is the transitions between the Mass Effect games, where each prior installment gets imported into the sequel, so that the player's journey is cohesive, and their choices in one game influence their options in the next. After that, there are games like Pokemon, where you can transfer critters from one game to the next, and games like Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2, which stars your previous created character as a prominent NPC. Perhaps most interesting of all, though, is a game that reads data from another that isn't a sequel or spin-off, something completely unrelated. Psycho Mantis puts on an incredibly charming magic show in the original Metal Gear, reading the player's memory card and listing off their game history, though I can't help but wonder why nothing like this has ever really happened since. Why hasn't some game grilled me for how many hours I've put into Dark Souls, or Terraria, or Metal Gear Rising? Why hasn't my Smash main been dug up and thrown in my face? Our technology has only gotten more and more intrusive, why hasn't our media taken advantage of it? If time is money, then the time we regularly spend on our entertainment is extremely valuable. If you've ever lost a memory card or overwritten the wrong save, then you know how valuable your data is. But if that value is real, then video games ought to use it to push boundaries. The interactive medium has held memory hostage instead of just tired old time before, but very rarely. I'll point to two key examples here. The first is the original Nier. 30-something hours into the game and you've finally seen the whole story. You've seen each character's perspective, each recontextualizing what you've seen before, and you finally beat the real final boss, and you're given an ultimatum. Your trusty sidekick is quickly turning rabid, and you can either put them out of their misery or cure them by erasing your existence from history. That means deleting each save slot for the last cutscene. This forces the player to actually say goodbye to the characters they've gotten to know over the course of multiple playthroughs, and really drives home the melancholy ending. Any quests you've left unfinished are just gonna stay unfinished. Sorry, but you're done with the game, because the game's done with you. I did say there were 2 examples of data being held hostage, however, so let's get to that second one. I promise this one is a bit more cheeky. It's also special because it does so much by doing almost nothing at all. You're getting to the end of Batman Arkham Asylum and you're having a pretty decent time. You're on your way to engineer an antidote to the game's MacGuffin, but then out of nowhere the game glitches out and resets all the way back to the beginning. The crash is loud, startling, and threatens to uproot your entire experience with the game. But in reality, it's just a fourth wall breaking jump scare, another hallucination from Scarecrow's fear gas. Unlike Nier, this moment manages to use the value of the game's data against the player without actually ending their experience. All the stakes for none of the cost. It goes such a long way to mess with the player while actually doing nothing. Even after the fake reset, the game is giving you false button prompts and unavoidable death screens, prompting you to use the controller's quote-unquote middle stick. Those aren't the only games that pull off this particular brand of shenanigans, but I think those are the 2 most interesting extremes. The takeaway is that games can, but rarely do, put the player in unique, interesting situations with all the information they gather over the course of a playthrough. That makes it incredibly effective when it lands. Healthy checkpointing is a must, playstyle analysis creates character, different games have the ability to play off one another, and our data can be used against us. The fourth wall has been broken before, but the medium needs to keep finding new and innovative ways to screw with the community. We've come a long way from pinball, and the only way forwards is that a way.